Hey everybody, Paul Peterson. I'm the founder and CEO of Next Leaf Solutions. We trade as oils on the CSE. We're in a Vancouver-based extraction company that has been focused on the industrial scale extraction, purification, delivery of cannabinoids. We're the first company to have a U.S. patent around the extraction and purification on an industrial scale of cannabinoids, and have since gotten 50 on the Canadian market. But also looking at IP and applying that IP globally.
My name's Howard. I'm a managing director at Mackey Research Capital. We focus on, generally speaking, on small mid-cap stocks, growth stocks. Our firm has been very active in the space. I'm one of a team of professionals who have serviced issuers servicing the cannabis industry. And I would say that our firm has taken a leadership position in the past, and we are always, we try to be tuned into the market as best we can.
And I was going to say, Howard, feel free to lob any questions up towards me. We actually worked with Joe Van Stuper at Mackey when we went public.
Yes, that's right. I remember. So yeah, it's glad to have another successul alumni on the panel. So very happy to see you there.
Feel free to lob vice versa.
So there's some growing chatter about the supply-demand equation in the extract market. What's your forecast? How do you see it? Do you see it coming into balance? And what's your sort of forecast, sort of near and medium term?
Yeah, so our forecast is more around price, and what we're seeing, I would say, is extreme commoditization of distillates and bulk oil, and that's really been driven by supply and demand. There's a lot of biomass out there. Obviously, biomass has a certain shelf life. If you don't sell it really in the first 90 days, then that product can't be sold as flour, so that's going to go into oil. And because so much capital has gone into building out large-scale cultivation, there's just way too much biomass, over 700 tons of dry the last Health Canada data. So what that's doing is commoditizing the B2B space, and obviously it's commoditizing the extraction space. But at the end of the day, I think we 3 years ago expected this to happen. We looked at what the market was, even 2 years ago, it was 50,000, 60,000 a kilo for THC distillate. Now that's anywhere from 9 to 13,000. So there's this extreme commoditization that's happening, and I think we're obviously excited for the opportunity because we really built a platform around being able to withstand that and be a little bit more optimized, a little bit more focused on efficiency and throughput. And we just really think that this space will be a little bit of time until there's enough distribution that's going to keep up the current supply of cannabis.
So is in your mind that over time, as the distribution improves, you'll see better margins going forward, or?
Yeah, I think over time margins will improve as more efficient operators, weather the storm. Less efficient operators will leave. There's a number of publicly traded LPs that have been growing and producing cannabis for 5 years now, and some of these guys aren't making money yet. And I think there's going to be some shakeout of that group. And really, at the end of the day, it's not about how much you can produce; it's how much you can sell. And I think that's the part that everyone's really missed. And being able to sell really comes down to price and quality. And I think there's just some businesses in this space that were just built too big for how long it's taking for legalization to roll out based on Ontario and kind of the lag in enough legal points of retail. But in time, the supply channels are clearing. I mean, we're seeing market equilibrium happening right now. Just got a text from a large real estate brokerage firm that said, BC Tweed just so. And that's probably going back to growing bell peppers. You know, there's big facilities, greenhouse facilities that were converted from growing food into growing cannabis in Ontario that are being switched back, and you know, I think that's what happens when there's too much production. So it's, you know, the market's finding this equilibrium.
Yeah. Have you seen any, you know, just sort of shifting to sort of current events, have you seen sort of the dynamics of the market change by the last six to 9 months since we entered this pandemic?
For sure. I mean, and I think in positive way. I mean, if you look at the month-over-month sales, retail sales in every province, I mean, it's headed in the right direction. Just sales aren't rolling out fast enough to support, I think, just the amount of commercial grade production that's out there. You know, companies overbuilt. They're asset heavy. They're operating OPEX heavy, and you know, have things improved since the pandemic? Absolutely. You know, look at Ontario. You know, great growth, and that's going to continue for the next couple of years. But I think, you know, it will continue to be an environment where there's a lot more supply there and there's demand, and it really is going to come down to, you know, companies that can work with a very lean model and weather the storm.
Yeah. What do you have a sense of what your break even is?
We like to talk about break even in kilos. So, you know, current market economics, we're going to sell 50 to 60 kilos a month of distillate, you know, and that's obviously current market economics. So, you know, we think we're the right size because we can scale up to fulfill a contract and process, you know, about the same amount of material as guys that have 10 times more people than us. Other processes in Canada, and I think by being smaller, a little bit more nimble, you're going to have an advantage in not have this big carry cost, right? That you know, just takes you longer to get to profitability. I mean, that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing a lot of companies that are getting small fast, and I think it's hard to do that. I think it's a lot easier to be right sized from day one.
For sure. You know, looking south of the border, there's been a bit of a wave of optimism that's come up. You know, my take on it is that it's driven in part by the politics in the U.S. Perhaps there'll be, you know, polls are pointing to a Democratic win. Do you feel that you guys have some exposure to some positive developments in the United States?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know what you think of the U.S. situation, Howard, and how it impacts cannabis deals that you guys look at and opportunities.
Well, certainly we've seen, you know, just sort of looking at the movers over the last couple of weeks. Certainly, there's been a serious uptick in activity and financings in the United States. You know, we think it is driven by U.S. politics. Certainly, the polls are pointing in the direction of a Democrat win, and especially Kamala Harris has come out vocally in favor of legalization. So certainly that type of sentiment could drive that type of view could drive it. That being said, you know, how it will turn out, you know, is anyone's guess. I mean, we've been in this situation before where, you know, the incumbent Donald Trump was down in the polls, and he pulled out a win in 2016. So it's really, for me at least, anyways, it's really difficult to say definitively what November 4th will look like in the United States. So, but certainly there is definitely. But there's no question about it. There's definitely optimism built into the cannabis stocks, and I would say they're almost betting on a Democrat win. That's sort of my take of the situation over the last little while.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, obviously U.S. legalization is the big catalyst that the industry probably needs, as far as from a kind of a you know, renewed interest perspective. And I think to some extent, especially the U.S. MSOs, I think there's a lot of kind of U.S. legalization that's probably priced into that, and arguably maybe some of the Canadian ones as well, like the big guys like the Constellations and the Cannabis. But I think at the end of the day, it's going to take minimum 4 more years until there is a system in place like we had in Canada 2 years ago. So, federal legalization, I think in a best case.
Fair enough, but keep in mind that most of the exuberant market activity, and keep in mind, I just come at it from a market perspective, was in advance of legalization. It was almost like, so I think that there will be a big wave of interest if history repeats itself and Canada is a model for what's going to happen in the United States. Yeah, you're going to see a lot of speculative investing coming back into which is what you need now. There could be a spillover effect into Canada. Certainly, in my mind, that would, by way of merger and acquisitions or different ways, MSOs looking to go north of the border. So, if their boats rise, inevitably, I think all boats will rise, because if you have one sector looking to establish itself, if you have the U.S. players looking to grow, then inevitably they're going to start looking at north of the border, where you have well-established players, if possible. I mean, like we saw some north-south transactions try to happen. Whether it goes south to north, that's still a matter of debate. So and legalities, frankly. So we'll see.
My take on that is, I think we're going to see more Canadian companies actually put capital in the U.S. I say Canadian companies, but if you look at a Kronos, over $1 billion cash, and more importantly than that, they've got a certain infrastructure that they built in Canada that's built around regulatory compliance, and I think that's the biggest thing it's going to slam the U.S. is when the FDA starts regulating this thing federally, and a lot of these MSOs that have been more or less operating in the Wild West. I think are going to struggle, and I think a lot of MSOs were built at a time that bankers, no offense, Howard, were slamming assets together and kind of giving what the market wanted. And I think there's limited due diligence on some of these U.S.-based cannabis assets that are in kind of let's call it unregulated markets, where there's no strict kind of GPP regulation around production and the same kind of framework that we would expect in a federally legal market. So I think that there will be some shaking out of the less financed companies. I don't think it's going to happen overnight with companies being able to really go multi-state. I think it's going to be state by state maybe for a while. If you look at the FDA, it's been over almost 2 years now. With the farm, the farm bill, and they haven't put out regulations around CBD edibles and these sorts of things. It takes a long time. I mean, it took Health Canada a great deal of time. Obviously, we move very slow here, and I think the big difference is in the U.S. when it happens, it'll happen faster, but I think it'll take some time.
Yeah, it'll definitely take some time. I'm not even convinced it'll happen faster, to be honest. But again, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because you still will have activity going on in that direction, so which will create an overall positive environment. And frankly, it was after the legalization that there was you had about a year of activity after legalization, and then seemingly then sort of reality hit a little bit. So it was a bit of a the hangover, so to speak, so I think that there will be assuming that if there is a Democrat victory, I think you're going to see the U.S. markets open up dramatically, and it could have the capital markets open up dramatically because of the U.S., the enthusiasm on the U.S., And I think that it will create opportunities in the cannabis sector. So that to me is sort of the nearest term catalyst that I can see. But again, we won't know until next week. Yeah. But it is interesting. There's definitely been a significant amount of capital that's gone into the sector. We've seen more activity in the last month or so than we've seen in the prior year almost in the cannabis sector. So it's material.
Where is that capital flowing, Howard? Is that in Canadian cannabis, U.S. cannabis, or international cannabis deals? Like I say, outside of North America.
So I think it's been directed towards U.S. operators right now, by and large. I won't delve into specifics, but I would say it was supportive. It is supportive of the thesis that there's a coming wave of legalization in the state. So I think that's where you're going to see. So either U.S. MSOs that are listed in Canada will be very likely able to attract capital, or I would say Canadian operators looking to diversify further into the U.S. could possibly be seen as favorable as well, for sure.
And that have the right size operating platform as well. I think in Canada, which is the big thing. I think some guys just have too big of an operating platform that they're.
Well, it does beg the question to see what will be the future for cross. I mean, it won't solve anything near short term, but it does beg the question: Will Canadian operators will there be cross border traffic? I don't even know. I don't even want to venture a guess as to what that might look like. But they won't even let you go cross border, let alone cross international borders. But it possibly could bode well.
So since this is an international panel, and one of the things to talk about is legalization outside of North America and Europe, and obviously specifically New Zealand. I think New Zealand's an interesting one. We're hopeful that they'll follow our lead and legalize with this referendum. And I guess we expect to hear by the end of the month. Any thoughts on that? What we're going to see there, and what the appetite might be in another federally legal jurisdiction, albeit a smaller one?
Well, it's on a knife edge. The polling throughout has been all over the place, and in fact, most recently the polling was trending towards negative. We had some results that were really, really low, like 35%, 39% support. I'll just load up one of the examples from the news. That's the sort of numbers we were looking at less than a month ago in support of the referendum. But what has happened is there's been a few unexpected quirks in the election, and that a minor party has won Auckland Central, which is our most popular city, and that was by a Green MP, Chloe Swarbrick, who was actually in charge of basically running the referendum campaign. So there is a hope that rather than being 50-50, like some of the other polling had shown, is that perhaps we did have that missing million turnout of the under 30s who were typically very poor at showing up to the polling booth. So one of the other cannabis companies in New Zealand, Helios, had actually been tracking this over time. And this was their polling data over time, is when the medical bill wasn't really through Parliament, there was really strong support for legalisation. But since then, it's trended towards a more negative, and their very last polling result, they ended up neck and neck at 49.5%. So we don't get the election results. We get interim referendum results on the 30th, but I think it's the 9th of November they publish the final results. So we're all sitting here with bated breath waiting for it to happen.
9th of November, public, it gets posted. Nice.
Yeah, so in 2 days' time, we get some interim results, and that should give us a good indication which way it's going. The other clues would be if the election data came out and they did show an uptick in registrations and voting by under 30s, because as with other countries, generally people over 55 are against it, and everyone under 30 is for it. So it really was about voter turnout. That's really going to be the deciding thing at the end of the day.
It's really interesting because when you look at it, if you look at the data, right, in Canada, we just passed our 2nd year anniversary of legal cannabis for adults, and we've had 0 deaths in 2 years. And then obviously, if you look at the Colorado numbers, you've got kind of 6 years, 5-6 years of data. And I always find it's interesting, even with that, and I think that the harm just hasn't happened that people in both Canada, but in Colorado and some of these U.S. states that have legalized, some of the naysayers and the challenges that they've said, or the social impact, the negative social impact. We haven't seen that. The data hasn't shown that. So it's interesting that it still is such a slow process, even in pretty liberal countries, or what we perceive anyways. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in Europe. I mean, when we look at it, I think Europe might get left behind as far as being able to attract a lot of capital investment. I think just with the U.S. may move faster, and I think especially if borders get opened up, import export becomes a thing. Europe's such an expensive cost jurisdiction. Just the amount of over-regulation that we're seeing in places like Germany. It'll be interesting if that domestic market ever takes off. But New Zealand will be really interesting, especially how this might impact Australia.
Yeah, so Australia, having already effectively decriminalised or legalised personal use in the capital territories, I think they're allowed to grow 2 plants. And they've kind of just snuck that under the radar, but it's only in the region. But in the New Zealand space, the whole regulations and the entire bill is very much written in a non-commercial way. So the top 3 vertical producers are only allowed to have 20% of the market allocation each. And I think they're reserving something like 20% for the micro growers. So all the people who are growing illicitly, the intent is to try and entice them over to the legal markets in a rapid fashion. They'd like to basically do it a little bit faster than Canada on getting the transition to legal. But we had a really strong no campaign by a charity that's tied to religious fundamentalists in the United States. So there was a lot of know-how coming in from sensible approaches to marijuana from the United States and from Drug Free World, which I think has links to Scientology and that sort of carry on, whereas the entire legalization crowd was self-funded by their users, I guess, because all the big vertical companies from Canada that used to have lots of cash to splash around, with their share prices, suddenly don't feel like sponsoring legalization and that sort of thing.
I think a lot of companies realize too, like the size of some of the markets. It's hard to justify. And again, you come back to Germany. I think Germany was 3 tons of cannabis that was consumed, through the legal medical channel, and I think being one of the larger markets, that's just been the challenge. Companies got overextended on some of these international jurisdictions that have been slower to roll out and slower to ramp up, and I think the end of the day. It takes years. In the legalization movement seems to be a very grassroots movement, even in Canada. I think it happened because a court case happened for medical, and that Supreme Court case allowed, I think, a federal program that lowered the inhibitions of government to actually look at what the voters in Colorado and the regulators there did. And it's happening. I mean, I think over the next 20 years, we'll definitely see this as a global phenomenon. Nextleaf, as a company, we really focused on registering intellectual property and patents in jurisdictions like New Zealand, Australia, across Europe, jurisdictions that we think in the next 20 years, these patents will become commercially valuable. And we really look at our time horizon being 20 to 25 years, in the sense that governments are going to be legalizing what is currently the most popular illicit drug in the world, and it's a drug that has tremendous benefit from a substitution perspective on more harmful recreational or pharmaceutical drugs. So it'll be interesting to see kind of what international opportunities roll out. Howard, what do you guys look at as far as CBD? I know, say a year ago, CBD, international CBD deals seem to be very kind of in vogue, and I think especially with the U.S. not rolling out CBD regulation, that's one of the problems. But there's been some tremendous challenges in the CBD space. What do you?
I mean, I think you're right. I think some of the, you've got it really on two fronts. You've got it on the regulatory side, and then you've got it on the demand side. I would say that, CBD was kind of, my analysis is that CBD was stopped cold or significantly diminished. Again, impacted by the pandemic, frankly. It was, CBD topicals are a discretionary consumer item. And we saw, at least in the short term, that a lot of those types of purchases were curtailed. I think there is a bit of an uptake. So like the Charlotte's Webs of the world, they suffered. I think as a result of it, we did see some consolidation. If you recall, they did an acquisition as well of basically a product-driven company, and for a time they seem to do well. But my view is that again, we're CBD is uptake is really also a function of broader market sentiment. And I don't think we're out of the woods yet in terms of market sentiment. I think it's still I think consumers are still cautious, and I think they're by and large sticking to staples. And I don't think CBD really fits the consumer basket right now. That could change, and so we'll monitor it, but that's sort of my assessment of the situation, short term, at least.
What do you guys think is the biggest risk to legalization, to the cannabis industry's kind of let's call it continued growth, not just in North America but globally?
That vote at the UN in December. If that goes sideways, and some of those recommendations from the WHO on rescheduling don't get through, I think that'll slow the medical growth down quite fast in the emerging markets.
Yeah, and I again, we spoke about it earlier. I think we'll have a pretty big data point next week, whether depending on which party wins the U.S. elections. If the Democrats win, at least whether it translates into legalization or not, there definitely will be a market sentiment that's supportive of a view towards legalization. So I think you'll see definitely an uptick in the enthusiasm there. If they don't, then it's if Donald Trump wins re-election, I think you're going to see more of the same, is my take. Because there's going to be no, I mean, the only, I actually probably 6 months ago, I wondered whether Donald Trump would be supportive of using, legalization in his platform to seek re-election. But, I think if anything, he's taken more of a hardline stance against it, because that plays into his base.
Yeah. I was just going to say that, and I said last summer that I thought Donald Trump would get reelected, and that it would be at least another 5 years until someone touched legalization. It would be the next party. And I do believe that. I just think that, at the end of the day, if Trump gets reelected, I think the best that we see is the States Act, which I think there might be a lot of pressure on fixing banking. This 280E thing is a tremendous issue. And I don't think the average investor really understands what that means. And companies that can't essentially expense business expenses, and there just isn't enough margin for companies to pay the cost of regulation and have a lot left over when they're kind of building these business models on the fly. Right. Industry with enough meat in the bone. So I think, there'll probably be a significant lobby effort, especially from the U.S. hemp farmers. You would think there'd be pressure on the FDA to roll out robust regulation on CBD products being able to be regulated and sold like a natural health product in the United States. And I think that'll be good for the industry. It'll create a barrier to entry. It'll push out some of the supply. And most importantly, it'll allow CBD companies to get more consumer confidence, because unregulated, untested products will not be in the marketplace. Should be interesting. Any other trends globally that you guys see next year in 2021?
Shane, did you want to kick that off?
Well, just speaking, because I've got a tunnel vision on New Zealand, it's where I live, but certainly down our way, there's going to be a lot of consolidation, because we've already, just for a little country of 5 million people, I think we've got 5 or 6 companies that want to go full GMP vertical. And then we've got another dozen or so cultivators that are looking to supply biomass into, and there's already a supply glut globally on the medical side. And in addition to that, looking over the ditch to Australia, I think the last check I saw, there was over 150 products in the Australian market. So there's going to be some consolidation there, because a lot of those products are not actually shifting much in the way of units on a monthly basis. So we talk about softer words like consolidation and things like that, but for some of these companies that aren't able to make the sales and get their products into the hands of patients, it's going to be catastrophic.
Well, and consolidation's a hard word too, because I think it gets thrown out a lot, like we hear that in Canada. And if you look at what's happened the last 3 years with consolidation, not sure how successful it's been. I mean, a lot of those companies are now shutting down facilities and getting smaller, when it was all about consolidating the industry. And I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's about being at the right scale for the market.
Yeah, there'll be a lot of destruction of shareholder value in Australia and New Zealand. And I picked, there'll be handful of companies in New Zealand. There might be, say, 1 or 2 importers and 2 or 3 of the vertical producers who can make it. And the same in Australia, there might be 4 or 5 importers and maybe 10 of the local vertical producers who make it. And some of them have got varying scales, but they're already trying to get into Germany. And, we've just seen the prices starting to tumble there as well. So, they make business plans on the prices from a year ago. And fundamentally, the cost of production, I don't think they can match the emerging, companies out of Colombia and Spain and Uruguay.
Yeah. Well, and even Canada. I mean, if you look at a number of GMP certified producers in Canada, tremendous amount of capital has gone into these assets, and they've got to move product. And at the end of the day, I think there's a certain scale that comes with a company that has the regulatory in place for these exports. And that's the problem with the export market. It's very costly, and it's very it's very time consuming, and it's taken a long time for there to be enough domestic production in some of these markets, some of these smaller markets. But there's a lot of supply out there, and I think it's a good lesson. It's not about how much you produce; it's how much you can sell, and being able to be the right size, the right scale, and be able to be nimble enough to kind of weather the storm, as legalization all in whatever jurisdiction you're in is going to take longer than people expected. If you look at Canada, I mean, that was now 5 years ago that Justin Trudeau and the Liberals got elected with a campaign promise to legalize this stuff. 5 years to get to where we are, and we have 100 and some legal retail outlets in the most populous province in our country. It's taken a long time, and it'll take other countries a long time as well. And I think that's the challenging thing is when a company gets a little too ambitious with raising and consolidation, and maybe getting a little too over the skis.
Yeah, it's good to touch on how long it actually takes, because our experience in New Zealand, the Labour Party in the 2017 election, their campaign promise was to legalise medical cannabis in 100 days. As soon as they got into government, they changed the fine print, and it was to introduce legislation to Parliament within 100 days. And even then, they did nothing. Basically, their legislation was a compassionate clause for those with a terminal condition. And the rest of it said, we'll let the Ministry of Health write up some regulations over the next couple of years. So from when they actually introduced when they got into government and when the regulations went live was 888 days, so a little bit longer than they promised. And then on top of that, the new scheme has a transition period for existing products from the likes of Tilray, who's the dominant player in New Zealand, and some of the local importers. They were supposed to have 6 months to get all their products up to GMP with full shelf life data and that sort of carry on. And even that had to be extended because that 6 months elapsed over with COVID, and they've then discovered that actually there's a section of the regulations that's broken, so no one's met the quality standard yet, and now we've got till March 31st to get it fixed. And then looking at local production, if we're lucky, the companies furthest ahead in New Zealand might have product for Q3 next year. So that 100-day promise, turns into well over 1,000 days.
Yeah. Optimistically.
Yeah. So when the referendum happens, if we get a good result, I'm picking it's going to take 3.5 years to get through the regulations, and then it might take another year or two to actually get the scheme up and running with retail and outlets and production on that side of the fence.
Well, what do you see, Howard, as the biggest catalyst, other than obviously what happens next week in the U.S.?
Well, I mean, that's the big catalyst. I mean, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but that's the big one looming in front of us right now. And I think it's going to be fairly binary in terms of what happens going forward. I think that if there is a U.S. election, then that's going to be a huge catalyst in the industry. We've already seen it. We've already seen it coming into the markets. I do think, just to sort of pick up on a couple of the things you guys were talking about, I do think that there's going to be, either there's going to be right sizing of operations over the next, continuing of right sizing of operations. We're seeing, various production facilities announce reductions in capacity. And, I do think some players are going to have to bow out or be consolidated. Ultimately, we're going to have to see, the market, like any market, right? Like if you look at to pick a commodity product, if you look at the soft drink market, you see, there's Coke, there's Pepsi, and then there's Cot, the low cost option, right? So I sort of see that cannabis is not much different in that regard, right? If you look at the cigarette industry, there's a few large players, and then maybe you have some, and frankly, you have some illegal production that is on the side. I sort of see the market needs to go in that direction, and so it's not different than the cigarette market. It's not different than the alcohol market. It's not different than any other large market. So right now it's fragmented. There will be a consolidator, and the consolidation will be not necessarily to add products, but it will really just be to shutter competitors. And I think that's what you're going to start seeing over the next period of time, because I think the market has to head in that direction. And once you have a couple of large, call it a duopoly, or then you'll be able to see them start to raise margins, raise prices. But until then, it's going to be tough sledding. So hopefully, over time, if a consolidation theme does emerge, then hopefully that'll be a driver of the market. But I think in short term, if you want to see enthusiasm towards a new growth market, those are going to be driven by legislative developments.
My kind of take on it is, if you look at the winery business, there's lots of wineries everywhere, and I think for kind of craft cannabis, for cultivation, that's where you'll see the number of smaller players, right? But I also think that's only part of the business. Guys growing a kind of that small batch, very high quality dried cannabis. That aroma is going to be very important to the consumer that's going to smoke that in a dried form. The other side of it is consumer packaged goods and kind of the processing side of it. And I totally agree. I think that's going to be more like the beer business, more like typical CPG where there's less players. Much larger investment required, whether it's extraction, whether it's manufacturing, and it's going to be a chunk of companies that really battle out the shelf space in both the kind of the deregulated CBD market, but also in the more highly regulated THC market. I think you're going to see in Canada and the US the molecules kind of get treated separately. But processors, I think will continue to kind of produce both, and really it's going to come down to scale, and it's going to come down to technology, efficiency, and similar like the beer business. Companies just are going to disappear, and brands aren't going to be able to survive just based on price and quality. And but I do think that there's going to continue to be this kind of craft market on the flower side that is unique a little bit to cannabis versus CPG, because I think when people talk CPG, that makes sense for products, for oil-based products, but not necessarily on the cultivation and flowers.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think there is definitely room for a craft market for sure. It's a must. It's just where you could, for a commercial market, like, so for a mass market, your grow cycles are 8 weeks. Craft market cycles can be 12 weeks, for example, just to use some rough metrics, right? So those are much more expensive and costlier to do, but they do command a premium. Last time I checked, the wholesale market was still substantially higher than than your typical sort of mass-produced flower. So yeah, I would agree with that. The question is, at what scale really the craft producers can they produce, really? And then I do think that eventually the black market will diminish substantially, is my sense of it as well. Consumers having a choice between something that's regulated and frankly relatively safe, as opposed to the black market. I think consumers, all things being equal, would prefer to have a legal choice that enables them to at least be comfortable that there's nothing, like in the terms of pesticides or what have you, to be potentially harmful for what they take in. I am actually quite bullish on alternative forms of delivery still, whether it be edibles or long-acting pills. So those are some areas that I'm following as well. I do think users of cannabis want some alternatives just to flower, because there are health effects of flower as well, right? So and I think that people want to be able to see alternative methods of delivery be effectively employed, so that they can control dosing, that they can sort of tailor their experience, and not necessarily have to take it by way and use and not have to consume it by way of combustion, which frankly there are health effects that we're still in the early days of it, but it wouldn't surprise me if in 10 or 15 or 20 years from now there's going to be some significant health related issues related to the consumption of cannabis by way of flower. So I think that's something that you'll see increasingly consumers who are health conscious, demand to see alternatives that address those health concerns.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about cannabis, while it's only been legal in Canada for adults the last 2 years, I mean, people have been consuming this stuff for decades, and it's been BC's biggest export for years, illicitly, of course, and I don't think we've seen the harm. So I actually think that adoption happens faster as people are looking for kind of less harmful recreational substances, less harmful pharmaceutical-based substances. I think the challenge for the industry is government, and I think if you look at like vape as a category, it's very interesting. And then to your point, Howard, like totally agree. Like the smoking market is only going to be a part of the market, right? Consumers are going to want a non-combustible form. If vape, I mean, in the first 6 months now, it's overtaken pre-rolls as the second consumption, second largest consumption format. I think a year from now, that segment will even double, especially as the price of oil derivatives comes down, as consumers try these regulated vape products that I think consumers are going to be more readily switching from an illicit, unregulated product when they remember what happened in the U.S. with these unregulated vapes, and obviously in Canada there's never been a case with a regulated product causing death or serious harm on the illicit market. So I think you're going to see consumers, you're right, gravitate out of the illicit. We're seeing that now. I think what's hard is on the dried flower market. There's so many communities that have these growers that have been entrenched in culture. The informal market's not going to go away anytime soon. So government has to step back, allow this thing to be taxed a little less. If you look at California, the legal product is taxed, and the price is 50% higher. And that's because of the cost of compliance and tax, right? So that's a big price difference for consumers. When at the end of the day, there's a huge portion of that consumer market that doesn't care if they get a legal product or an illicit product. They want the best quality product that money can buy at a certain price point.
Right.
And so I think the more kind of hands-off government takes as far as taxation and maybe trying to milk the cow before it's ready, I think you'll see that illicit market go away, and I think ultimately you'll see positive consumption roll out much faster.
I think that's right. I think, Paul, you're clearly bringing the Vancouver, the BC perspective to the table. And listen, let's be honest. There's no greater cannabis culture globally probably than in in the greater Vancouver area. So I agree with your comments. Looking at Ontario though, it's a much less. It's a more traditionally commoditized environment. So in other words, like consumers are out there. They'll go to the local retailer. You'll basically hear conversations. Again, I'm now bringing some anecdotal evidence. It's sort of like, what's the THC content? They're not really looking at the brand so much. They're just like going, okay, what's is it indica? Is it sativa? What's the percentage? I want something sort of mid-range. I want something high range. I want something low range. You know what I mean? And then that's how you see it. Whereas, in BC, they'll have known the grower for 20 years. They swear by his product, and they know everything in and out. Like they know the genetics of the flower that they're getting, right? So it's a very different state. And look, it could also speak to where the market will go, right? Because let's say, 30 years ago in Toronto, if you had Crown Royal, you were considered a connoisseur, and now it's all the single malts and it's all the various types of the boutique type whiskey. So I do see that headed in that direction as well, but it's a long way off.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah, Paul, I just wanted, Paul and everyone, I just wanted to bring up a question that came in from the audience for Shane, asking if New Zealand has seen any exportation of CBD oils isolates yet, and if yes, about how much is the demand currently? Does exportation into New Zealand need to be TGO 93 compliant, same as Australia jurisdiction?
Right. So the current market demand in New Zealand is a bit up and down month on month, but I think at the moment it's roughly about 2,000 bottles of CBD oil a month. So it's not terribly high, but it is growing month on month at about a 10% growth rate. But at the moment, we've actually got a higher standard than Australia's TGO 93. New Zealand's got a proposed quality standard that is a bit counterintuitive because our government is quite small. So, for example, you'd assume EU GMP would be good enough. But actually, our mutual recognition agreement is actually dated from 1998. So it's before all of the Eastern European and Balkan states joined the EU. So we don't recognize, for example, I know you're in Colombia. So, for example, we don't recognize Clever Leaves EU GMP because they got it done by Croatia, which our government doesn't recognize. So our standards are from a very small list of trusted countries. We need a GMP cert. Canada's among them, which made it easy for Tilray. So Tilray's the dominant player in New Zealand. They've probably got just under half of all CBD products, but they've probably got northwards of 80% of all THC products because their only competitor in the THC space is GW Pharma with Sativex. So they've got the run of the house at the moment. And that's just because they were agile early on. And yeah, I helped get them into the New Zealand market, I think, in 2017. So the short answer is no, it's not TGO 93. Yes, there's imports, and that's all our CBD at the moment is imported. None of it's locally made yet. Our local producers, none of them have even had their GMP audits yet under the new scheme. So it's going to be all imports for at least the next 12 months. But the barrier to entry is incredibly high.
Great, thank you. And Paul, was there any other thing before I tossed up that question in terms of comments or questions that you had left on your end?
No,
All good? Okay, great. Well, that brings us right at the end of this conference, and I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, as well as thank you to all the panelists for accommodating kind of a little bit of a last-minute change of plans here on our global updates panel. And apologies to the attendees for that last-minute change-up. So that will conclude the Cannabis Society's Global Virtual Conference. Thank you, Paul. Thank you to all the panelists, and thank you for